be upon you. Welcome to Way Stations. My name is Rehan Khan, your co-host for today's show, where we explore the case for reading. I'm joined, as always, by my regular co-host, Dr. Walead Mosaad. Dr. Walead, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Rehan. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Really looking forward to today's program.
Me too. I think we have an interesting discussion ahead of us.
Indeed, indeed. Now, I know both of us are readers. Now, I don't know what your reading habits are like, but I certainly try and, spare time I have, I do try and fit in a book with me at all the time, whether I'm traveling, I'm sitting around. And sometimes I might be reading a couple of different books, depending on my mood, really. So, sometimes my mood might be, oh, I want to escape into a story, into fiction. So I'll always have some fiction. I may have read it before, right? But I'm kind of reading it again. Sometimes my mood might be a bit more reflective. So perhaps I'm reading a book which is kind of faith related, or it's something to do with history. And sometimes I'm reading because I need to prepare class. So I'm reading maybe a management book or something. So I tend to be reading a few things at the same time, depending on mood and depending on kind of function, really. But I think, certainly amongst my friends, I find, I don't know if you have the same experience, but generally reading is in decline. And we're obviously a bit sort of older than, many people who are probably listening to this program. And it's also in decline amongst youth in a very big way because of the, allure of social media, gaming and screens. Although, I have read that amongst the minority of youth, some of them are going back to reading, some of them are going back to board games, but it's a minority. It's not it's not the majority who are doing that. And I think there are many things we could talk about with regards people who don't read. Perhaps you're limiting your ability to have a deep conversation with someone. If you don't read, perhaps you're limiting your imagination. There's tons and tons of research on the fact that the impact of not reading and what that could do. And I don't want us to really focus on that because this program is not about making people feel depressed and sorrowful about the fact that they're not reading. But what I think probably want to try and do is focus more on the case for reading. So what can this actually do for you rather than what you're missing out on? So it's more about what this can do for you. And I think that's what we want to kind of focus on. But let me start maybe, Dr. Walead, I've just shared some of my reading habits there. Maybe perhaps you can just share some of your reading habits briefly as well, and then we can get into the program from there.
Sure. I think I have a similar pattern to you. I tend to read more than one thing at the same time. And it is subject to what I feel like reading at the time or what I'm researching or studying, or perhaps what I'm trying to present something or teaching. And so I usually have maybe sort of an arc of a cyclical thing. If I'm focusing on a particular subject that I'm trying to impart to other people, then I may just have a deep dive into that particular subject and then read whatever I can concerning that subject, both from, let's say, traditional sources, traditional Islamic sources, and then kind of look at it from modern perspectives, if I can find it. So that kind of keeps me interested, to be honest with you. And, on the subject of reading, and you mentioned that people have so many other things that are alluring. And the thing is that with social media and all the other things, it is a form of reading. I mean, even if you're reading a tweet or a WhatsApp message or even the photos on the Instagram reel tend to have words with them. But I think what we're talking about is something different. And, the idea of reading for leisure, or reading to learn, or reading to get information, or reading to transform oneself. There are different intentions and modes of reading. And, that I think it would be important maybe just to point out a few things about why reading to begin with. What's the point of, and what is the written word? And most historians agree that the written word started pretty much with humanity, with the written civilization. And obviously there were kind of things graduated from there, and early human beings perhaps wrote on rocks and depicted pictures that then would tell a story. So, Egyptian hieroglyphics, or even before that, the Sumerian tablets and all that sort of thing. And these things still exist today. I mean, I've been on recent trips where I see these hieroglyphics, in Egypt in particular, written on rocks that you're driving along a road, and you can kind of make out some of it. There's a picture of a bird and a rock and a person, and it tells a story. So it means that that person who put that there, who took the time to inscribe it, and back then probably to affect a written word, was much more painstaking than today. Not as simple as just typing on your computer, but having to inscribe in rock or carve it in, it was an effort. But they felt that that was important, not just for the people who they can relate the story to in their own time or in their own sitting, sharing a room, but for posterity, for people to come after. And that points to the idea that human knowledge, in a sense, is cumulative, and that what one group or one civilization or one generation can produce will have a bearing and benefit for those that come after them, and then that group then will build upon that. And to me, the Islamic tradition very much shows that. So maybe, unlike other traditions, you have people who wrote books maybe centuries before, and then someone comes centuries later and actually annotates what they wrote. What we call the commentary tradition. And so they're still kind of living with that particular text. And I know that was in other traditions too. And obviously in, Catholic religious tradition and the Jewish rabbinical tradition also, they had a similar thing where they're talking, looking at something from before and then commenting on it. And so it's kind of like it's not like an ossified dead thing, then you're living with it and you're engaging with it within your own particular context, your own particular time. And, even if we look to postmodern theories like of deconstruction and Derrida, and they're going to start saying, well, it doesn't really matter what the intention was of the person who wrote it. I can make it mean whatever I want it to mean. And while I completely disagree with that sentiment, but it's still showing you a level of engagement and, let's say, a critical analysis with things that came before, with written words that came before. So I think it's very much part and parcel of our humanity. And I think what we're in danger of losing if this trend continues is that we don't really put a lot of stake or of importance to previous knowledge, to cumulative knowledge. And then we tend trying to kind of do the same thing, but we're doing it on our own this time, and in a sense, reinventing the wheel. And if you look at, even people who are in positions of political power or the celebrity culture, or, you find the level of, let's say, engagement with the public or how they speak, very, very superficial and not at all intellectual. And even, I have to say, in some places, intellectualism is frowned upon, as if it's something that should, it's better to be more folksy and speak in the vernacular and address people on that level, and that's seen as, in a sense, more appealing than to be intellectual. And I think, yes, there is a danger of being intellectual in a sense that's exclusive and perhaps, haughty and arrogant and so forth. But that doesn't mean that we should completely dump any sort of intellectual activity, especially for people who have responsibilities for others and have responsibilities for, for commerce, for economy, for politics, for making decisions that affect, large groups of people. The greatest statesmen and stateswomen, they read a lot. And if you look at the reading habits of, let's say, early presidents and prime ministers and so forth, I think they read quite a bit. And that informed their decisions and transformed them into how they sort of see things. So,
yeah, can I just ask you something there on that? Because, we definitely notice when it comes to conversations, people do, sometimes when you're in a social setting, and someone is talking, they talk very superficially and then they jump to another subject and they jump to another subject. And it's almost like they're talking like an Instagram feed, right? And you want to get into a more detailed conversation and you find that you can't because they don't have the depth, they haven't read in deep on the subject. And then it's really frustrating. So, I mean, the question I had to you then really around this was, in terms of from a faith tradition, and many faiths have this tradition of being a steward of someone who is there, who is obligated to look after the environment, the world, around them. How important is reading to also to fulfilling your role as a steward?
I think it's essential. I think if you ignore it at your own peril, and not just your own peril and risk, but everybody else that you're a steward over, um, and that you have a responsibility over. And it's not just reading for information. It's not just reading because I don't know anything about this subject. And then I think the process itself and the exercise itself is transformational. And I think you've read a lot of these studies. I've read a few of them, but the idea how people's brains adapt if they're used to just reading algorithmic feeds, and and you kind of talked about that very briefly right now, and your brain functions in that way. So you're like seeing things as a real, and if you fall into that, these studies show that you can't. It's very difficult to get into what we call deep reading. To be able to sit with a book and cover page to page to page and sit there for any length of time, because it requires focus, right? And it requires your mind not wandering all that often. And as you're reading the words and you're thinking about them, and I guess you're internally interpreting them and imbibing them, and perhaps even remembering something of those things. That's work, and so that's why it's easier for people just to take, just like there's the junk food, crisps and processed things that are easy to eat and easy to find and easy to just take in, versus, I have to prepare a meal and I have to think about the nutritional value of this thing, and maybe it's a little more expensive. And same thing with reading. So we have like this diet of junk reading, basically. And we talked about AI a few sessions back, but now this whole phenomenon of AI slop, where perhaps who knows what percentage of what we're reading on the internet is produced by AI right now, but I would figure it's getting higher. And we're kind of reading sort of the same thing. There's kind of a uniformity to the monotony, though we don't even realize it. And the thing with, if you're reading from different sources, different books, different authors, civilizations, I don't think that's something the internet can offer you right now, and in such a meaningful way. So I think anyone who's a steward of anything, and everyone is a steward. We have a prophetic tradition that says all of you are stewards, and all of you have your flocks that you have to watch over, whatever it may be, in whatever capacity. So if you're not engaging with thoughts other than your own, that's the other thing. I think the psychological mental health aspect of this, if you're only sitting with your own thoughts, and let's say you're not even engaging with people and you're not engaging with books, it's kind of like you're mired in the swamp of your own anxieties and perhaps illusions about things that are not really there, not really real. Versus if you're at least reading and engaging, then that is a type of sohbah or companionship that you're having with those ideas, those thoughts that came from somebody else. So I think, no, it's absolutely imperative and important that especially people, the more that they responsibility they have, that the more that they read. And like we said earlier, I think people who are statesmen and so forth, they blocked out time that they can read and they can engage with things. But I know that you've worked with this with a lot of executives and business leaders and so forth, and they'll probably say to you, well, we have no time, and everything is so fast, and we always have to be making these split-second quick decisions. So, how would you present it to them beyond what you've already spoken about to us?
Yeah, so I guess if I was trying to present making a case for reading for someone who is a bit skeptical about it, I would say, and I just want to build on what you were talking about, this whole thing about stewardship, because we are all in some way stewards. You might be a steward of a company that has 100,000 employees. You might be a steward of a household where there's two of you. You might be the steward of a flock of animals. So in some way you are a steward, you are a leader, you're in some capacity. So if you think about that role that you occupy as a steward, there are, I think, a few things that fiction, and I'm going to talk about fiction. I'm not going to talk about non-fiction. I'm going to talk about fiction specifically. Mm-hmm. So stories, how they can help make you a better steward or make you a better leader. I think number one is that when we read stories, we often come across characters who are facing a moral dilemma, right? something which is nuanced. It's not black and white, right? Maybe the character is dealing with an issue around self-deceit or likability or greed, but they're grappling with something. And when you read that, you're kind of projected into that moral dilemma with the character. And I think there's something quite didactic, that something quite educational that you can pick up from that. I think the other thing that someone who's maybe skeptical about reading stories and fiction, I would say, fiction can also give you a sense of affinity and closeness with a character in some way. So I'll give an example. There's a short novella called The Machine Stops by E.M. Forster, which I've actually got here in my hand, which obviously people can't see, but you can take my word for it. I've got it in my hand. And the story is really set in the future about, I won't go into the details of the story, but what it's about is how people have lost a human connection with each other. Now, this was written in 1909, but anyone reading this today who is feeling lonely, who is feeling isolated, will have an affinity with the story. They'll have a closeness with the story. They'll feel that this book, written in 1909, about how humans in the future lose connection with each other, is speaking to them. So there's something there. There's something there. And when more people read that, then you can start to talk about it. You can start to discuss it, and you can start to say, well, is this really the norm? Should we really be living in these kind of isolated, atomized, individuated kind of in this manner, or is there another way of doing it? I think what fiction also does for someone who's maybe skeptical about reading stories, it gives you the opportunity to reflect on choices that human beings make. Now, often stories relate to, again, keeping a simple concept, something like, greed. Now, probably, some of us will remember there was a film, I think it was in the 80s, maybe. It was Wall Street. I think Michael Douglas or someone. Yeah. And
Michael Douglas. Yeah.
That's right. And the main character, Gordon Gekko, he said, like, greed is good, right?
Yes.
And then you had all these brokers on Wall Street walking around saying greed is good. Obviously, greed is not good, right? Greed is not good at all. But that's what it was kind of putting into the popular culture. Greed is good. So books like Leo Tolstoy's How Much Land Does a Man Need speaks about a peasant who essentially craves more land, and he tries to acquire more and more and more land, and which leads to his death. And ultimately, the only amount of land that he needed was 6 feet. And that was for his burial, right? And again, you read a story like that, and it brings a sense of humility because it allows you to reflect, right, on the situation. And I think stories also, they provide a certain moral imagination for us. They allow us to see things from other people's, perspective. And so in some way, what I've said in terms of what stories do with regards giving you a sense of affinity, a closeness, allowing you to reflect, allowing you to develop a sense of moral imagination, what they're doing for you as a person is that they're building your capacity to become a human being. Because when you read these books, it heightens your ability to solve complex moral situations. You read a book and you think, what can I learn from this primary character? What they're going through. What elements of the story are easy for me to relate to? What's really hard, and why is it hard? What are the conflicts taking place in the story? How are the characters rubbing up against each other in terms of conflict? If I had to advise one of these characters about the moral dilemma they're facing, what would I say to them? Right? Because then you can start to think about, how can I apply this in the real world? So really, I would start by making sort of comments about that to someone who's skeptical about reading. This is about capacity building. Just as today you might make an investment in a fund, for example, you think, I'm going to keep this in my pension long term, and you make that investment today because you want to have the capacity in the future. What reading does, you make that investment today because you are telling your future self, I value what you will become, and I'm building capacity for the future. So I would say, even if you wanted to look at it in pure materialistic terms, it's about capacity building in yourself, if you want to look at it purely in those terms. Obviously, it's a lot more, but if that's the only thing that really floats your boat, then look at it in that way, that this is about
Well,
capacity.
what would you say I had to someone who responded to you with that and said, well, I watch YouTube videos and I watch all these information things and I feel like that's building my capacity. Well, what do I get out of reading that I wouldn't get out of watching these videos?
Yeah, it's a valid point. So I think what these kind of much more mediated bites of reels and YouTube videos, and even if longer ones, what they do, they give you information at a certain level, but you are essentially in a receiving mode. You're receiving content. Now we know in terms of the way the brain works, new neural pathways in the brain form when you have opportunity to reflect, to think. When you're constantly receiving, right? Especially people watching short reels, right? What's happening is your mind is not having time to reflect. So you're at one level, you're feeling pleasure at the level of dopamine, but in terms of your cognitive function, building new neural pathways, being able to imagine, to innovate, it's not doing any of that for you. So yes, watch it in short bites if you want, but give yourself some time to read, because that's where you really develop yourself. You really dive deep, cognitively, you dive deep into your imagination because you have time to reflect. You're transported into a story. And that slower form, all the research tells us, is what really builds your capacity in many, many ways. Yeah.
Interesting.
But what would you like, let me flip the question back to you then. If you had to make a case for a reading for someone who's skeptical, what would you say? How should they approach that?
Well, from, let's say, a religious paradigm perspective, the first word that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was Iqra, which means recite. And then when he was commanded by the Archangel Gabriel, to read, he said, Ma ana biqari. He said, I am not one who reads. So the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was unlettered, meaning that he did not have knowledge of the written word. But yet nonetheless, the angel still commands him to read. And then he says it 3 times. And then at the end he said, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. Read in the name who has created you. And here, many of the exegetes or commentators on the Quran would say, here reading, or sometimes this word Iqra is translated as reading or as recite. It actually has a linguistic meaning of to gather. So even the word the Quran is a variation on Iqra, because it means the gathering of letters and of words. And the inimitability of the Quran, or what we say in Arabic, A'jaz al-Quran, is based upon having access to the same letters and same words that everybody else has access to, but then the lack of human ability to be able to put them and organize them in the way, what one of the ulama says, a nazm, that to relate the meanings that the Quran relates. And so, there are many things to say about the Quran, but it speaks to you multivocally. A single verse can have more than one connotation, one meaning, equally valid, things like this. And then what's reading in between the lines. So, for a believer, a Muslim, the most engaging text that they'll engage with is with the Quran. And all the things that you said are absolutely 100% true. To the degree that we're encouraged to always be reading it. Some people have this idea that we read a book, we're done, put it on a shelf. But most people who have a literary bent, and like you mentioned earlier, you reread a book. And the Quran is the most reread book, I think, in the world, most likely, because some people keep a constant khatam or recitation of it. Once they finish one, then they move on to the next. So you're always reading it every day. And it's not monotonous because it's that engagement with it that makes it what it is. And, I don't think you get that with YouTube videos and movies. And, you can watch a movie and then maybe watch it a couple years later. It might still be a little fresh for you. But if you watch it every day, it becomes torturous, right? I mean, it doesn't become but I think with a book, to reread a passage, right, even if you did it, in close intervals, I don't think it's the same. I think you get something different out of it, because you're kind of, your state of mind, what you absorb from other things you read, the connections that you can make with, oh, I read this passage here and I also saw it over there, and this author talked about it in this particular way, and so forth. None of that you get with modern media. I don't think, not in the same way. And so, reading multiple books at a time, and some people take notes and are able to, form, new. That's how I think they say one of the ways new knowledge is created, that you form connections between disparate things here and there, and then you see the patterns within them. And when you start to see that for yourself, it's like there is a type of pleasure to it. I don't think that can be the same as watching that great scene or car chase or whatever it is that people see in a film or in the cinema. So uh, it's one of those things we can sit here and talk about it for hours, but unless you really not just try it at a superficial level, but actually give it a really good try and be patient with it and struggle a little bit in the beginning. Like for people who haven't read in a long time or never really made a habit of reading, they will find it difficult in the beginning to maintain their attention and so forth. And obviously, I think what would help with that is try to, put a pause or at least minimize the other things that would grab your attention. And I found personally at a level of subconscious, if I'm reading something, I'll go to sleep, I'll wake up, and then the ideas that I was thinking about or that I was reading somehow crystallized in a way that I didn't have before I went to sleep. So I don't know. I compare it to like marinating a steak or something. Let it sit overnight, and then when you wake up, you find like, oh, okay, I see that now, and this connection, another connection, and so forth. So there's a whole world out there, to be honest with you, that I think we're missing out on if we don't allow ourselves to get to reading. But
And actually, just on that, like it's interesting because I generally read before I go to sleep. I try and make it a habit of reading 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And normally, if I've read something, and I won't try and read something too exciting before sleeping, like a page turner of a novel, because I'll just keep reading. So, but I will maybe read something a bit more, thoughtful and reflective. And I find that it just kind of helps me get to sleep. Whereas if I make the mistake and, like everyone, I make sometimes make the same mistake. I might end up like watching something before I go to sleep. Okay. You have a very troubled sleep. It really is very disturbing, I don't know
absolutely,
if you have the same experience or not.
no, absolutely, yeah. I make that mistake too, and then or maybe on the phone and watching the news or whatever. It's not the same sleep that if I read something, especially something that is maybe inspiring or captivating or not page turner per se, but something food for thought type of thing. And then I want to kind of just sit on it while I sleep and see what I think about the next day. But again, I think a lot of people will say, I don't have the time. I'm very busy. I'm so forth. What sort of, like in a practical sense, what sort of pointers, what case would you make for them to kind of get started or how to go about doing it?
Yeah, I mean, earlier I was talking about generally for most people, some reasons why you'd want to read. Maybe I'll focus a little bit on executives and managers because they often ask me, I'm really busy at work and, I don't have time to read, why should I read? So if I was answering that question for someone who was in a kind of work setting or as a manager or a supervisor, I'd say, well, if you look at all the studies around the future of work skills that people need in the future. So what skills do you need in the future to be successful, right? When in a world where there's more automation, there's more AI, there's all this other tooling. So what human skills do you need to develop? And generally the studies come down to a few different traits that we need to develop as human beings to be relevant in the future. One is self-discipline. So self-efficacy, the ability to organize yourself to work on a task. Okay. Now I think you can learn a lot from reading novels and fiction and literature about trials and tribulations that people have gone through that will help you in that area. Another one is around self-awareness. So how does your mood, how does your the way you're kind of projecting yourself, how does that affect other people? So being aware of yourself, right? And how you see yourself and how does that affect us? You can you can learn a lot from reading literature about that. Empathy, again, that's something which is a really important future of work skill that we need to develop. You can learn a lot from reading fiction because when you read fiction, you suddenly see the world from someone else's perspective. It boosts your level of empathy. Okay. And there's many, many other kind of future of work skills that the research talks about, your agility to learn, your generosity, your kindness, and so on and so on. So I think just if you're, again, looking for a purely, I want to be relevant in the future, in terms of employability, then I would say reading will help you harness, sharpen, and focus these kind of human skills that you really need to be relevant, right? So that's I think from a more materialistic perspective, that's why reading would be good. The other thing I would kind of encourage maybe executives and managers who have some responsibility for teams is to think about almost like doing some kind of book club or doing some kind of shared reading experience with your employees. Because in most organizations, people come from, well, people obviously in teams, they come with different experiences, life experiences. They come from different backgrounds. And so when you read a book together and then you discuss it as a team, it's amazing the kind of conversations that come up because you'd have read it with one set of, experiences, worldview, and you take, that away from the book. When someone else who comes with a different set of experiences and worldview reads the same material, they're going to take away something very different. And what that suddenly does, it just gives you much more of an expansive sense of ideas. I mean, one book that we're reading in a book club that I'm involved in right now is called The Remains of the Day by Kazuru Ishiguro. And it's really a story about a butler who we're looking at, the main protagonist is a butler, and he's reflecting. This is like a English butler of a stately home in England in the 1950s and before that. And he's reflecting on the subject of dignity. And what does that mean? And so the whole book really, in many ways, is an exploration of what does dignity mean, right? Really fascinating, really fascinating. And so when you say to people dignity from different cultures and different faith backgrounds, I think there's a commonality. We all kind of understand what a dignified person is. But when you read about that through literature and then you discuss it in a group, it really raised some really interesting questions, right? Likewise, sometimes these books, they allow us to delve into how characters have competing viewpoints. So, for example, one classic by Sophocles, which is Antigone. Antigone is about King Creon, who his allegiance is to the state, right? His allegiance is to the state, whereas Antigone, her allegiance is to family. So she just wants to bury her brother, who basically fought the king, but she wants to bury him and give him a respectful burial. Whereas King Creon says, no, he just wants the body left and let the dogs eat the body. So his allegiance is to the state because her brother is seen as a traitor, and her commitment is to family. So there are two conflicting viewpoints. That is your allegiance to the state or is your allegiance to the family, right? And that's sort of playing out within this novel, within the story. And business leaders often have to deal with that situation as well. One scenario I've often seen is, and I've seen it, I've had to face this as well, is that that in a particular division in the company, next quarter that division is going to be shut down. Okay, for whatever reason, maybe it's not making enough money or whatever, but that information about that company, that division having to be shut down needs to be embargoed for 3 months because that division is still bringing in some revenue to the organization. You have a very close friend who is in that division that's going to be shut down. And your friend is just about to buy a property where they're taking a hefty mortgage. Okay, what do you do? Is your now allegiance to your company because your company has said this information is embargoed, you're an executive, you have to keep your mouth shut, we don't want to have an impact on your on the revenue, or is your allegiance to your friend, okay, because they can get into a really bad situation and maybe you can just tip them off. But if you tip them off, they might tell everyone else in that division as well. So you see, these are conflicts that we see, in a working environment, but these are often played out in novels. And once more, it just helps to really, build capacity in our mind as well. So yeah, so I think that's kind of another thing I'd really say to executives and business people. But I wanted to come back to something that you mentioned earlier as well, which is this concept. There's a concept in the tradition of sohbah, of companionship, that a book can also be a form of sohbah kind of across time. Can you explain that?
Right.
How can a book be a companion across time?
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting way of looking at things. And when I teach online or teach in person, and we're looking at, let's say, one of the texts that we're studying, I tell them I see myself as making an introduction for you. So I'm getting you familiar with the sahib, or this companion of mine that's been a companion for me for, let's say, X number of years. And now I'm making an introduction, and I want you to take this as your companion as well. And what inspired me for something like that is I saw that many of the ulama and the scholars, that's how they saw their books. They would take them with them when they traveled, and they would be rereading them, they'd be annotating them, had a regular relationship with these books. And it's the book is representative of that the person who wrote it and the ideas that they had. And I don't know if you're familiar with Mortimer Adler, who edited the Great Books series. So I think this was like early 20th century, and they looked at the Western canon more or less, and they looked from the very beginning, and they looked at what were the great. He also had this concept of the great ideas. So, what were the great ideas of civilization? What did people think about? What were these authors talking about? And then he has like a companion book called The Great Ideas, in philosophy and theology and economics and political science, so forth. And then he looked at all the authors, and they included people like St. Thomas of Aquinas and Isaac Newton, and Karl Marx, and others, looking across the spectrum of that. And one of the points that he made is saying that when you read these books, you then join this other thing he calls the great conversation. So these ideas are thought about in different ways and discussed in different ways throughout history and throughout different epochs, and everybody brings their background, and perhaps even you could say their biases and into how they talk about these ideas. But then when you start reading them, you become a member of the club, so to speak, or the member of the community, I should say, like from our perspective, the member of the community, or the grander or greater sohbah. And you're in that too, because now you've read some of those ideas, and perhaps you will form some of your own, and you'll weigh in on something. But like any community, you can't just walk into a community and say, "Okay, I think you guys should be doing this and doing that and this other thing," and they don't know you, you don't know them. No, you have to. There's initiation, right? So you have to, befriend them. You have to be initiated into it. You have to read enough. And then, like what you mentioned about book clubs, then we get into it and we start exchanging ideas and talking about it. So you're really having not just a sohbah with the book, you're having a sohbah with the author, and you're having a sohbah with the ideas and the civilizations behind these ideas. And all of those things you can't really avail yourself of via video or any other media, I think. It only comes from reading and what Adler calls deep reading or analytical reading. He says sometimes you can just read for information and you get like a very superficial understanding, but he advocates the idea that you really get into it and you take notes and put things in the margins. And these things sound antiquated for a lot of people. Like, what are you talking about? Like, people don't do that anymore and so forth. But I would advocate it. And I would say, even if you're accustomed to using like a Kindle reader, or the ones now that I think you have one of these things I have seen that you can write with, which is okay. But there is something to be said about actually the pages of the book and having a physical book in hand and able to to write with your pencil or your pen and take notes with it and so forth. So that all becomes part of the sohbah, that all becomes part of the companionship. And I think it's very grounding and makes things more real. We had a few sessions back, we talked about craftsmanship a little bit and working with your hands. And I think this plays into it. So reading can also be seen as a craft. I think it could be a sanaa, just like, creating things with your hands. You can say, I'm a craftsman in reading, because this is how I engage with the book and the ideas and so forth. That's, I think, kind of the idea of sohbah, and also the idea of rereading things and then engaging with it and so forth.
Can I just mention something there, which is, I think, as you were talking about that, one thing that came to my mind is that I think people are always looking for like a what's in it for me? Like, why should I do this? It's like, how can I make a quick buck if I do more reading or something? I feel like before people would read, like you were talking about annotating, making notes, people would read because they would believe that it's like an investment in virtue. Yeah. So
Hmm.
because virtue is seen as very important. Like you want to deal with people who have virtues, a virtuous person. A virtuous person is someone who has good character. They're reliable, they're trustworthy, they're not going to lie. And people would be seen by their virtue. Yes, this person has virtue. You can work with them, or and so on. And I think that notion has kind of gone away to some extent. People are not looking at how can I become more virtuous. So what they're looking at is how can this help me materially? Like, I mentioned at the beginning, for instance, I read books sometimes because I have to teach, right? So I'm doing a little bit, from a perspective of I have to teach this course. So I'm reading, but and I'm hoping I'm getting some benefit there as well. So I feel that people struggle with understanding like what am I going to get out of it? I don't know if you see that, but I feel that's kind of missing a little bit.
Yeah, it's kind of what do they call it when ironic because on the one hand maybe people feel that way because they don't read. They haven't read virtuous books, so they don't have a capacity or the appreciation of what's virtuous to begin with, and things fall back to the lowest common denominator of what's pragmatic and practical. And if you look at, let's say, even academic departments in universities today, they are cutting funding for these sorts of departments that work with whether either the literature departments and humanities in general is in a steep decline and suffering because people are failing to see, well, how's that going to get me a job, and how, practically speaking, how is that going to translate into work? Though I've read some things more recently that they're finding that new graduates who don't have that humanities aspect, they lack in other things that is needed for a work environment. And so some recruiters and executive recruiters are looking for people who have some sort of humanities background also, in order to kind of be able to get along with other people and engage with ideas and the idea of creativity and write things. Now, with the advent of AI, I don't know how if that's still important or not, but I think there was a realization that it's not just about the very practical aspect of it, but reading and education as transformative. And the great Malaysian scholar who passed away recently, Sayyid Naqib al-Attas, rahimahullah, talked about this in depth about education and adab, and that reading and education is not just for a practical purpose; it's supposed to be transformational. And as you said earlier, to not to form the citizen of a state only, but to form the human being. And to form a human being, that means that you need to be this idea of tarbiyah and availing yourself of knowledge. And the thing people also don't realize, if you only read contemporary things, you read magazines and things, and a lot of those things are kind of opinion pieces and what I would call unvetted knowledge. If you read something, and our teachers told us this, when you read something older that has gone through centuries, you're reading something vetted and very much accepted by the community. So like in the Islamic tradition, when we talk about the hadith of Bukhari or of Muslim, or the revival of religious sciences by Imam al-Ghazali, these are vetted books. So they no longer become just the province of the author, right? So even if you critique them, you can't say, oh, Ghazali was wrong in this and wrong in that. You're actually critiquing the whole ummah, the whole community, because the community has accepted it and the community has made it part of the canon, and the community still reads it, the community of scholars or the greater community. So when you read things like that, again, the sohbah concept, and also the idea, this is vetted knowledge. This is something you can trust. This is something that many eyes before you have looked at and have said, this is okay. You can read this for knowledge and for benefit, and you'll get a lot out of it. Versus things that are contemporary today, which I'm not saying they don't have that necessarily, but it's hasn't enough time hasn't passed. Not enough eyes have seen it. And with the practical aspect and a lot of pressure on people to publish things, and we know that studies have been fudged and numbers have been manipulated, and so I rather go with the thing that I can trust and has been vetted by many people before me, rather than spend a lot of time on the things that I can't trust as well. So, I mean, I think that's kind of the gist of the whole thing. I think there's many aspects to it, but
Yeah, yeah.
uh,
I
I
mean,
don't know.
what I would say is also, I think, and maybe just going back a little bit more to the kind of material side of things, and because sometimes executives ask me about, what lessons they can learn from literature as well when they read literature, like why. I think, like personally, what lessons they can learn. And I think one thing I would say is that, look, most people don't aim for they aim for success in life. They don't aim for destruction. But we often see people self-destruct, right? So they're aiming for success. They're not aiming for destruction, but they self-destruct. And that's actually one of the hazards of success. So often very successful people self-destruct. If you read a work like Macbeth by Shakespeare, right? So Macbeth wants to become the King of Scotland. After the witches tell him about this, this kind of premonition, then he wants to become the king of Scotland. He becomes the king of Scotland, so he's successful, but that success leads to his destruction, right? And you often see that in the political sphere, you see it in the business sphere, you see it in the family sphere as well. So if literature explores that, then wouldn't it be interesting if readers actually, leaders actually read that, reflected on that, and actually realized that perhaps, pursuing a self-destructive course is not good for you personally. It's not good for your family. It's not good for your community and so on. But I think because success is so, seductive, it kind of gets pushed aside. So one thing I would say to, especially for, what are the lessons learned from literature? One is about the fact that when you are most successful, you can actually, self-destruct at that point as well. And then the other one is really about principles as well and pragmatism, which is the fact that you might have certain principles you stick to, but sometimes you have to be a bit pragmatic as well, right? What actually works? Because when you have two principles colliding with each other, especially in a working environment, then that's also a recipe for kind of disaster as well. And in one of my favorite books by Charles Dickens, Hard Times, it's about a very utilitarian father called Mr. Gradgrind, who brings his children up in a very utilitarian manner where everything is about numbers. It's all about facts. Everything's about facts, and there's no humanities, there's no emotion, there's no poetry, there's no storytelling. And his children grow up to become like really horrible, disconnected individuals. And then he realizes his mistake because his principles, his utilitarian principles were so strong that they didn't allow him to, consider that there's another way of doing things as well. So I think, again, literature allows us to explore some of these things, especially around principles and pragmatism as well. So are there any kind of like final sort of pieces of advice that you'd give around this whole case for reading that perhaps we haven't covered?
Yeah, I would just say for people who are listening and they feel a bit inspired and they want to kind of where to start. I just like with anything that you're going to start anew, you need to take it gradually and in baby steps, as it were, and find something that is not going to tax you too much initially in terms of what you read. But I would advocate looking at something classical. So if you're reading in English, something that whether it's Dickens or Shakespeare or even something a little bit after that, something that is of interest to you also. So that's important to get you, to get you kind of just situated to that, and to be able to do it on a daily basis also. And I think we've talked about this. Anything that's worthwhile that you're building within yourself really has to be done daily, and not kind of just when you feel like you have the opportunity to feel like it. And I think that's what's going to make the difference for people. So whether you're writing, whether you're reading, whether you're developing a fitness or athletic skill, musical instrument. I mean, everyone says that you have to do it daily and do it in little spurts. If it's 15 minutes before you go to sleep, or sometime in the middle of the day when you have a chance and it's 10 minutes here or something. So I think that's how you start off, and you'll find that it's like building. You're building your brain muscle as you do it more and you engage with it, and then when you start reaping the benefits of it and realizing that, then you'll be more interested. So that would be my main advice to the listeners who are interested in that. What
Yeah,
about
I think
yourself?
I'd completely second what you just said there. Start small. If you can only manage 5 minutes of reading, set a timer of 5 minutes, and then the next day make it 6 minutes, then make it 7 minutes. And when you're reading, you got to remove all your distractions, like remove everything. Otherwise, you're going to get distracted. Don't keep your phone there and so on. I think the last thing that I wanted to probably say that I wanted to say earlier, but I kind of forgot to mention it, was the fact that I think reading fiction is, I think, also a way to keep a very open mind about things. I remember there was a study done looking at something called cognitive closure. Now, psychologists and researchers, when they use the term cognitive closure, they're talking about a desire to reach a quick conclusion in a decision. And it's an aversion to ambiguity. So some people have a high level of cognitive closure. They want to quickly close things off because they want to make a quick decision, and they have an aversion to ambiguity, right? So what they found was that individuals who have a strong need for cognitive closure, they rely on early information cues. So, i.e., the information they get at the beginning, they shape all their thinking around that, right? And so, as new information becomes available, they're not willing to change their original view. So, although new information is becoming available, they stick to their original because they want to get cognitive closure. They want to, I've made my decision, it's done. I don't like this
Hmm.
ambiguity. So, as new information becomes available, they're not willing to listen to the fact that there might be a different hypothesis to the one that they originally formed. Okay. And so what these kind of individuals, what they do, those who have a strong need for cognitive closure, they also gravitate towards smaller bits of information and fewer viewpoints. Whereas the people who actually resist the need for cognitive closure, like I've got to make a decision very quickly and I don't like ambiguity. So people who resist that, they tend to be more thoughtful, they tend to be more creative, they tend to be more comfortable with competing narratives. So, in other words, they're really high on EQ, right? They're really high on EQ.
Hmm.
And so I think, there was one cognitive scientist. I don't know if she was responsible for this particular study I mentioned, but her name's Marianne Wolf, and she wrote a book called Reader Come Home. Now, in the book Reader Come Home, there's a really a nice quote that she put in there, which is the fact that she said, "The quality of our reading stands as an index to the quality of our thoughts." So the quality of our reading, stands as an index to the quality of our
Interesting.
thoughts. That's really interesting in terms of your ability to think deeply. If you haven't read, then you're not going to get there. So I guess that was the last thing I probably wanted to cover off. And I don't know if you have anything else to say, Dr. Waleed, or if there's perhaps, there's nothing else, we can maybe mention a book each and from our side and encourage people to maybe take a look at that book. So is there a
Sure.
book you'd like to read?
Yeah, no, I second what you said about this kind of cognitive closure. It sounds like the flip side of what they call confirmation bias. When you read the things or hear the things that solidify or kind of support already the way you're thinking, your cognitive frame, and then you're like, oh, see, this, and this. And that got me to thinking, when you're just reading off the internet and you're subject to the algorithm, wherever it might be, it's full of confirmation bias because the algorithm is going to give you the things that you agree with and the things that you like. And so then you wind up having this echo chamber. And that's hard to get out of it when you're using these mediated and orchestrated funnels of information, let's call it. Whereas reading, no one is putting an algorithm on you. You're taking these things. There's let's say you have a set of books you want to get through with varying viewpoints and different perspective and so forth. And like you said, that's going to open you up and it's going to make you a much more well-rounded, balanced person. So yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very important aspect of it. As for a book, I mentioned Mortimer Adler. He actually has a book that was written many, many years ago called How to Read a Book.
Mm.
Uh, and I benefited quite a bit from it. And it's something I still go back to. I actually have the original version. The newer version that's out there is similar, but some passages have been changed a little bit for the modern reader. But in it, he makes a point that there's a difference between just kind of reading for information and reading for understanding. And it takes some more of a commitment and a deeper level of reading for understanding. And he's a big advocate of writing in the margins and really living with the book and taking everything in. And he says that there are different levels of reading, and that when you approach a book, there's a way to approach a book. Even how you look at the cover of the author, where it was written, background of the author, things like this. So you kind of form a mental image in your head about, okay, what's this book about? And then, then you get into it. And also the idea, if you're reading many books, where do I place this book in kind of the whole scheme of things? What subject is it addressing? If the author is offering some ideas about a particular topic, are the ideas true? Do you agree with them? Does he support them? If you read them somewhere else, mentioned in a different way, how do you feel about that? So, it becomes quite a bit of a different intellectual endeavor. And then he says, basically, when you've read enough in different places, then you're quite ready at the level to go and kind of put your own ideas out there, or at least formulate your own ideas based upon the connections and the things that you've read. And, if you look to each individual, they may have like a set of the combination of unique background experience that they have may then lend them to coming up with new stuff, because they're able to get into this particular tradition. Someone maybe can read in Spanish and can read in, I don't know, Hungarian or something, and how many people can do that? And so they can see the similarities between, those two languages and what's written here and what's written there, and so forth. So I would recommend that book, How to Read a Book, Mortimer Adler, would be.
Yeah, no, it's a great book. And I guess in many ways, a bookshelf or a library that someone owns is in many ways a roadmap to their mind,
Yep.
if they've read the books on the bookshelf.
Yeah, you got to be careful what books you let people see.
It's a roadmap to their mind. Anyway, so the book I'd recommend, I don't know if you've read this one or not, it's called Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. It's from 1959. No. So it's a story. So it's Flowers for Algernon, Daniel Keyes, and it's a sci-fi novel. And it's a story about a man called Charlie Gordon who has a learning difficulty, and he has an IQ of about 65. And then they do an experiment on Charlie, and he becomes really intelligent. His IQ goes up to like 150, 60 or something. Now, he is so intelligent that he realizes that all the people who he thought were his friends before were just making fun of him. And now he's so bright that he doesn't have any friends because he's just too intelligent. But when the book is written in the first person, so when the book starts, you're literally reading Charlie's diary, and the English is awful. And there are spelling mistakes. And it's the writing of someone who's an IQ of 65. And after the experiment, the prose and the language becomes so mesmerizing and incredible. Now, without giving too much of a spoiler away, what happens is that the effects of the experiment start to wear off. And then you see that in the book. And by the end of the book, Charlie's writing is back to what it was at the beginning. Yeah. And the reason I chose that one is really a reminder for me and a reminder for everyone that whilst we have our mental faculties, we really should use our time to read, because we're not always going to have them, right? By the grace of God, some people will, and some people do until they're in their 90s and their hundreds and they have it. But we may not all. So I guess it's a reminder to myself and maybe to some others that, whilst we have the time, we should dive into those books, because we don't know what the future holds.
Well, yeah.
All right. So let's end with that. Thank you, Dr. Walead. Always a pleasure to speak to you.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you to all our listeners. And please, if you do like the show, do leave us a rating. It does help. And peace be upon you. And welcome back the next time we are on air. So all the best. Take care.